This is the Twin City News Around Town. A closer look at the people, places, and events around Batesburg-Leesville, Gilbert, and the Ridge. Presented by the Twin City News, Batesburg-Leesville's community journalism since 1925.
So talk to me a little bit about how how tropical fruit came to Batesburg.
Well, I've always been interested in growing palm trees. That's kind of obvious from the yard here, but I've been growing those really since I was a teenager and been kind of just a hobby. Got a little backyard nursery here and never really thought about growing citrus because, my experience has been that even in Florida, the citrus industry has been pushed pretty much south of Lake Okeechobee now because of, cold weather during the 80s and 90s. And so it never occurred to me that you might be able to grow citrus trees here. What kind of got me started on this was about 10 years ago, one of my neighbors, she used to live across the road, Drusilla Miller. She's moved to Aiken now. And I got two grandkids, and they came over to the house one day, and they were both eating tangerines. I said, "Oh, who gave you those tangerines?" And they say, "Oh, we picked them off the tree across the road." And so I went over there and looked, and sure enough, I'd never been in Drusilla Miller's backyard, but she had two large trees, about 30 feet tall, and must have had 300 or 400 tangerines on each tree. So this got my curiosity up. And because I've never heard of citrus being grown to any degree around here. So I started doing some research and found out that the particular variety of tree she had was one they called the Changsha mandarin, or tangerine. And so from there, I started contacting some people online here in South Carolina. There's a fellow in Lake City that's got a commercial satsuma orchard that's been growing for years I didn't know about. I thought I knew everything about palm trees in the state and what you can grow, but I knew nothing about the citrus, and found out that the variety she had was a Changsha. So I went about trying to get me some, and I've got several in my yard now growing, two of them bearing fruit. In fact, one of them this year for the first time bore probably about 200 tangerines, and I've only got about 10 left. And so from there, my interest kind of spread further. I found out there were several other varieties you could grow around here, including even some grapefruit. There's a guy in Columbia growing a ruby red grapefruit since the 1980s. And a bloom sweet grapefruit over on Lake Murray we've been picking grapefruit off of for about 6-7 years now. And really I found out one of the reasons why I guess I never thought you could, again, grow them here was because of, even in North Florida, they're kind of susceptible to cold outbreaks of, Arctic air. But the fellow in Lake City told me something interesting. He said, the reason we can get away with pushing envelope here is because citrus trees in Florida grow year-round. And so they never go dormant. So they're used to 80 degrees, bang, they'll get a freeze. And because the trees are actively growing, it'll kill them or do a lot of damage to them. He said here in South Carolina, we get a gradual drop-off of temperatures during the wintertime, and so the trees have a chance to go dormant. So when we do get our occasional, cold outbreaks, the trees don't suffer as much damage. And I've seen that to be the case in my yard. For instance, the Miwa kumquat here, this tree is about, I'm guessing about 10 years old. And grew it from a very small plant. I protected it the first 2 years till it got, a couple of feet high, but since then I hadn't protected it at all. It came through the polar vortex winter 5 or 6 years ago, had a little bit of leaf damage, but still bore fruit. And this year, I'm guessing, we've already picked several hundred fruit off of it. We probably had 400 kumquats this year.
So what does it take to get a citrus tree started growing in a South Carolina yard?
Well, one thing here in this area of the South, and we're in Zone 8A here in central South Carolina, and I think the key is to pick the right varieties, first of all. The Changsha mandarin does very well here without protection. It's not considered a commercial variety because it has a lot of seeds in it. but it tastes just like a regular tangerine. So, and it's more cold hardy. And I think the key too is growing them on their own roots instead of on stock wood that they normally sell citrus on. So if you do have cold damage occasionally, that the tree will come back true to form instead of coming back from the graft. So I think that's key. What's
different from growing a citrus tree versus all these beautiful palms that you've got here in your backyard?
Well, it comes down to picking the right varieties. There's a lot of citrus that wouldn't do well here, but there are I've probably got 6 or 7 different varieties in the yard, about half of which hadn't started bearing fruit yet. It's just picking the right variety, growing them on their own roots, so if you do have an exceptionally cold winter, they'll come back true from the root base. And the first couple of years, get them up to about broomstick size on the trunk. I found that to kind of be key. When they're real small, have a real small trunk, you might get more damage and it'll set them back a year or two. So, protect them a little bit in year 1 or 2 when they're still small. Then when they get big and too hard to protect, just let them go and they do fine. This variety is known as the Thomasville. It's a kumquat. It was a hybrid developed by a professor down in Thomasville, Georgia. It's very cold hardy. Grows exceptionally well around here with no protection. The fruit on this is best harvested when it's green. You can use it like a lime on fish or for seasoning, cooking. Very tough, sour, but this is a variety you could use like a lime instead of just a normal fruit that you would eat. Very tough. So.
And what's the season? I mean, I see the kumquat behind you's got nice big orange fruit.
I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of varieties of citrus don't even mature their fruit in California and Florida till January, February, March. We couldn't get away with that here. We need to have the fruit mature before we get really cold weather. So the kumquat here matures its fruit anytime. I've had it mature as early as September, October, as late as November, December, but we don't get any cold weather usually in those months. The Changsha Mandarin's another one. It usually matures around Thanksgiving, which is good because we normally don't get our hard freezes until January, February. And so again, I'm glad you brought that up because it is key to get something that's going to mature its fruit fairly early in the growing season.
But at the same time, that if you have those citruses growing in your backyard and it's maturing in December or November or whatever, you got fresh fruit for Christmas time.
And if you have a good winter, like this year we're having a good winter, now normally the fruit on this miwa, for instance, wouldn't be harmed until you get temperatures down around 20, 22. It'll take down to about 25 and won't really mess the fruit up. This year we've gotten down to 28 so far here in Leesville, and there's been no damage whatsoever.
So what happens? What happens to if we were to get a cold freeze this weekend to drop down into the low 20s? What would happen to the fruit that's
well,
on
the
that
fruit
right
that
now?
would be on the tree would be frozen, obviously, and so
it's got the
you could still eat it, but you'd have about 2 or 3 days to finish eating everything on the tree because after that point they start dropping off, and fruit wouldn't be very palatable, to say the least.
So when you're talking about harvest, as it were, the tangerine trees, and you would how many would you think that you would get off a typical tree once it's matured?
Well, now my bigger tree, which is my oldest tree, last year only had 8. That was the first year it bore any fruit. This year it probably had 200, and I hope it doesn't get any more than that because it'll weigh the branches. Some of my branches were actually literally weighed to the ground this year, and I had to prop them up and stake them because there was so much fruit on the tree. So I would hope 150, 200 on a 15-foot tree is about all it can sustain anyway. So it'll be interesting to see. I've got some other trees that bore for the first time this year and had maybe 10 or 12, and I'm hoping next year they'll have about 50 or 60. So it's more than enough to give away to neighbors and have plenty to eat.
Well, you're obviously a guy who's got a green thumb, but if you're somebody like me who doesn't feel like I'm necessarily agrarian at heart. Yeah. Could I grow a citrus tree in my yard?
Sure. And like I say, now site location is important. Every yard has its own little microclimates. I've tended to plant most of mine on the south side of the house where they get most of the sun in the wintertime, and you don't get the really cold northerly winds coming in with these Arctic fronts. And the miwa kumquat here is, if you'll notice, is planted 10 feet away from a heat and air conditioning unit. So it does, not a lot, but it does get some heat off of that. Might make a difference of 1 or 2 degrees. And, also believe it or not, the proximity of the swimming pool. A little bit of warm air coming off that water because it never freezes. So, site location's important. Protecting them for the first 1 or 2 years, and after that, just let them go, and you don't do much of anything. I can't really take credit for the production I had this year because I didn't do much. Just watching them grow.